Let's look at the architecture of a contract. It operates as a system of dependent logic gates, where certain actions are locked behind specific triggers. In law, we call these triggers conditions. A condition is an event that must occur before a contractual duty to perform matures. The mechanics are strict. If a condition fails to occur, the duty attached to it never becomes active. The machinery halts and the transaction is over. Black-letter law demands strict enforcement of these conditions, but enforcing every technicality to the letter can produce absurd, financially disastrous results. When that happens, courts possess the authority to step in and override the written text. To understand contract performance, you have to master both sides of this equation: the rigid taxonomy of how conditions are built and the flexible, equitable doctrines courts use to bypass them. We start by classifying conditions by their timing relative to the duty to perform. This text outlines the most common type, a condition precedent. This is an event that must happen before performance is required. Think of a buyer trying to purchase a house. The contract will usually state that the buyer's promise to purchase is conditional on securing a mortgage loan. Obtaining the loan commitment is the condition precedent. If the bank denies the loan, the condition fails. The buyer has no legal duty to go through with the transaction. Next, we have concurrent conditions. This occurs when both parties must perform simultaneously. If I promise to sell you my bicycle for $100, my duty to hand over the bike is conditional on your payment, and your duty to pay is conditional on me handing over the bike. The third category is much rarer, the condition subsequent. This is an event that terminates a duty that has already matured. We see this in commercial agreements, like in the case of Burger King Corp. Versus Family Dining. A franchisee had an active, binding agreement granting them exclusive territory rights. However, that existing duty of exclusivity could be terminated by a condition subsequent, the franchisee's failure to meet a strict schedule for developing new restaurants. Accurately classifying a condition by its timing is critical. When a deal collapses and ends up in court, whether a condition is precedent or subsequent dictates exactly which party bears the burden of pleading and proof. Beyond timing, conditions are defined by how they are measured. Contracts often include a condition requiring satisfaction, where one party's duty to pay is conditional on their personal approval of the other party's work. To prevent someone from dishonestly claiming they hate the work just to get free labor, courts usually apply an objective standard. If you hire someone to restore a piece of furniture, the court asks if a reasonable person would be satisfied with the result. But some contracts involve personal aesthetics or third-party certification. In a construction contract requiring an architect's final approval, the court applies a subjective standard. The architect is the sole judge, provided they evaluate the work in good faith. The requirement of good faith is rigorously enforced. In Western Hills, Oregon Limited versus FAO, a group of developers agreed to buy land, subject to their satisfaction with the city's zoning and development requirements. They eventually tried to exit the deal, claiming they were dissatisfied with the high cost of a required sewer system. The court ruled against the buyers. The evidence showed they knew about the potential sewer costs before signing the agreement. They were manufacturing their dissatisfaction to abandon a deal they no longer wanted. The law calls this wrongful prevention. Acting in bad faith to interfere with a condition's fulfillment completely excuses the condition, making the duty to perform absolute. Satisfaction clauses allow for flexible, human judgment in business deals. They are not legal loopholes. Courts heavily police these subjective conditions through the implied covenant of good faith. There is one specific scenario that pushes the subjective standard to its absolute limit: the attorney approval clause, commonly found in real estate contracts. We see this tested in Indo versus Dwyer. The buyers signed a contract to purchase a home, subject to the approval of their attorney. Within the specified window, their attorney disapproved of the contract, and the buyers walked away. The sellers sued. They argued that an attorney cannot simply exercise carte blanche disapproval. The rejection must be based on specific objective legal deficiencies in the document. The court firmly rejected the objective test. An attorney's primary role is to protect the client. Therefore, the attorney possesses an absolute right to disapprove the contract for any reason, provided it is done in good faith. When sophisticated parties explicitly bargain for the protection of independent legal counsel, courts enforce that subjective safety net. They will refuse to substitute a judge's opinion for trusted professional judgment. So far, we have looked at conditions operating exactly as intended. But what happens when the strict mechanical failure of an ancillary condition results in a devastating, disproportionate loss for one party? This triggers a powerful equitable doctrine. Rooted in the long-standing maxim that equity abhors a forfeiture, this doctrine allows a court to excuse strict adherence to a condition if enforcement would cause disproportionate harm. Consider a commercial lease dispute. A restaurant tenant has an option to renew their long-term lease, but misses the strict written notice deadline by a few days due to a minor clerical error. If the timing condition is strictly enforced, the tenant loses massive investments in property improvements and established customer goodwill. Because the landlord suffered no actual prejudice from the brief delay, the court will excuse the failure of the condition to prevent extreme forfeiture. This equitable override takes other forms, such as waiver. In the Burger King case, the franchisor had repeatedly accepted late construction milestones in the past. By acquiescing to those delays, Burger King waived its right to suddenly enforce the strict timeline, especially since abrupt termination would mean a massive financial forfeiture for the franchisee, who had already built several restaurants. Courts will even override express technical conditions in adhesion contracts. In C&J Fertilizer, an insurance company defined burglary as requiring visible marks on the exterior of the building. The court struck down this strict condition, ruling that such fine print technicalities cannot be weaponized to violate the reasonable expectations of the policyholder. Mechanical contract rules are not absolute dictators. When strict compliance turns a minor technicality into a financial execution, a court will deploy its equitable powers to override the text and preserve justice. Contract law requires balancing strict mechanical logic gates with flexible, human-centric equitable standards. Classifying conditions by their timing, precedent, concurrent, and subsequent, is the essential first step. It allocates risk and sequences the order of performance. Conditions of satisfaction demonstrate that the law relies heavily on the implied covenant of good faith to ensure subjective standards are not used for exploitation. And when the machinery of the contract threatens unconscionable harm, the system deploys equitable safety valves, such as the doctrine of waiver, the principle of equitable estoppel, and relief from extreme forfeiture. A contract is a living architecture. It is engineered to carefully sequence business relationships, but it is ultimately governed by the court's mandate to enforce fairness and true intent over rigid technicalities.